Thanks. Should we get started?
Yeah, sounds great. Let's get started.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you. Oh, wait, actually, Kirsten, did you want to go ahead and kick things off? Or else I can jump into my intro.
Sure. No, I'm just thrilled. I'm so grateful to see so many people on the line today. And I know there has been so much interest in our expert speaker series. And I'm so grateful for our speakers today, Councilman Chapman, Mr. Jones, and Ms. Davis. Thank you so much for joining us and providing your wisdom and guidance today for our session. And I'm thankful to our alumni office for making this possible in a time of COVID when we can't come together in person. It's so wonderful to have these opportunities. So thank you so much. And I'll turn it back to you, Ms. Robinson.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you again. So thank you for joining us tonight. This is our, as Kirsten said, our Expert Voices series with the topic of housing inequality and the impact on communities of color. Tonight's conversation is a continuation of our Expert Voices series, and it's featuring many of our Saints alumni. Last year, when we were required to halt all of our in-person events and networking, the Alumni Office started this series as a way to highlight alumni expertise to our larger Saints community. And we are really hopeful that even after we start traveling again and we bring you all back to campus, that we'll still be able to keep up the series as well, because I think we're really starting to reach some alumni in a different way than we were before. For those of you whom we haven't met yet, my name is Meredith Robinson, and I'm our Senior Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement. And I'd also like to introduce Allison James, who's on with us tonight as well, and she is our Associate Director of Constituent Relations, and we are your alumni office. And before I jump into introducing our guests, I just want to do a few housekeeping items. One is that this event will be recorded. We record all of our Expert Voices conversations, and then we post them on our events page later for everyone's reference. If you wouldn't mind during the conversation portion of this with our experts, if you could mute yourself. If you have any questions that you'd like to put in kind of as they come up, feel free to put those in the chat. And then we'll reserve about the last 10 minutes or so of the event for Q&A, and I will keep track of those then. And of course, if it's a small group, so we can make this conversational as well as the evening allows. And now on to our event. I want to thank everyone and thank our presenters. We are welcoming 2 alumni and one of our own Saints experts for tonight's presentation. Alan Jones from the St. Stephen's class of 1981, John Chapman from the class of 1999, Davis, who is our own Director of Institutional Equity and Diversity. Alan is a Washington, D.C. based financial services executive specializing in mortgage with 25 plus years progressive experience combining strategic leadership and innovation with strong communication and presentation skills. His professional experience includes government lending, housing policy, mortgage credit, regulatory agency relations, product development, data security, compliance, and risk management. I swear all the bios always trip me up. You should have heard me during our legal series. Currently, Mr. Jones is the managing director at Housing Financial Strategies. In this role, he serves as a mortgage consultant and advisor to C-suite housing finance executives, leading sales and execution. We also have John Chapman with us tonight, who was elected to City Council of Alexandria in November 2012 and re-elected in November 2015 and 2018. And I'm sure if any of you follow his social media, you'll see I think there was another kickoff for the next round recently. And as a member of City Council in Alexandria, John serves on numerous local and regional boards. Prior to his election to City Council, John volunteered in numerous roles for local organizations and boards and is a former president of the Alexandria branch of the NAACP, the youngest in the history of the branch. Professionally, if that wasn't, I read this, John, and I kind of chuckled because I was like, well, if that wasn't professional enough. Professionally, John is a career educator and currently works as a community use program specialist for Fairfax County Public Schools. And he also runs the Manumission Tour Company, which he started in 2016. And now to KiKi Davis. KiKi is the Director of Institutional Equity and Diversity at St. Stephen's and St. Agnes School, and she is a member of the senior administrative team. For almost 20 years, she's developed new multicultural curriculum, led workshops, seminars, and trainings for faculty, administrators, parents, and students on the pedagogies of theories and practices related to multicultural education, building equitable and inclusive communities, and creating culturally competent environments. In addition to her work at St. Stephen's, she has conducted workshops for organizations serving mental health professionals, parents, and those in the business sector, and presented at state and national educational conferences. She's also a member of the board of the Virginia Diversity Network, which is a consortium of independent schools in Virginia who provide professional development opportunities for faculty and staff. So this is who we're speaking with tonight, and I am going to switch over and share my screen, and then I will hand this over to KiKi. Everybody gives me 1 minute here. Okay. Whoopsie. Hang on 1 second. Something did not like happening with my PowerPoint. Give me 1 minute here. Allison, I may need you to share because mine is, for some reason, is only all grayed out. Oh, I think I maybe got it now. All right, let's try this one more time. Sorry, folks. Okay. Does everybody see my screen and the presentation? All right, KiKi, it's all you.
Thank you, Meredith. I'm just thrilled at the number of times you called me an expert in that introduction. So I'm thrilled with that, as I consider myself a lifelong learner and have much to learn about many things. But thank you. Feels good. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight, discussing a topic that is so important to our national conversation on race and the impact of institutional racism on roughly 40% of our US population. In this case, we're talking about housing inequality. And we're talking about that 40% who, for this conversation, we'll call people of color, but for those folks who do not identify as white. As we engage in the conversations about race as a school community at St. Stephen's St. Agnes, we acknowledge that many of the social inequities attributed to race is really the manifestation of racism. So I want to begin really briefly in my brief time here, in the few minutes I have, with a few definitions, just to give us some foundational, a foundation of where we're going to start. And so you can go to the next slide here. So we hear a lot of these words and we hear them interchanged. And so I think it's just really important to be clear what they are and what they aren't. So race, and I won't read these, as I think you can all read the slides, but when it comes down to it, race is a social construct, right? Race is an idea ascribed to biology, but not derived from biology, right? So it's something that's actually made up for a purpose, and that purpose happens to be this idea of racism. Racism is not, while race is a social construct, racism is not, right? It's a system of advantages based on race, right? Sometimes you'll hear it defined with the formula power plus privilege equals racism, and that's kind of in the simplest form. A whole nother webinar is, some of my issues with that formula when we talk about individual versus group racism, but that's another webinar. So we'll move on to the idea of institutional racism, which is really what we'll talk about this evening, or what I believe the foundations of housing inequality and social inequalities like housing inequality are really founded on. And that really is an institutional racism, is when racism becomes embedded as a normal practice in society or an organization. And I love this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates that said, "Race is the child of racism, not the father," right? And so we tend to sometimes flip that around, understanding that race was a product of racism. The reason that race was created was because of racism. So all that to say, housing inequality, right, is what we're talking about, is not a byproduct of bad choices or lack of hard work, ambition, or simply personal irresponsibility by people of color. It is a natural outcome of racist policies and systems meant to give advantage to one group over another, right? The systemic part of that is that many who benefit live in a world of privilege that doesn't allow them to even ingest, right, this kind of racism, because inherently it's not something that they would intentionally participate in, right? It's in fact, there was a professor at George Washington University that called it the fringe benefits of whiteness, right? These are privileges assigned to you based solely on being a member of a group. In this case, the group called white, which like racism is a social construct. But quickly, let's move on to housing inequality and how it's rooted in this idea of racism. So I'm going to give you really, and this is understated when I say that this is a brief and incomplete history of how some of how this was systematically put into place. There's so much more to this. At the end of my part here, I'll give you a few resources if you're really inclined to go deeper. There's so many wonderful books and video series about this and the beginnings of this. But I like to say that it begins at the beginning, right? It begins with who was categorized how. So what did it mean to be white and not be white? And this is important because soon after, laws and policies, both official and unofficial, came into being about the rights associated with race. And one of those, of many, right, was about land ownership. There was an act called the Allen Land Act, not as in R. Allen, but predates Allen, around 1913 and 1920, which prevented non-citizens from owning land. Now, this is way more complicated than just that simple sentence, but it came in and around the time when Asian Americans were fighting for citizenship, to be naturalized citizens, excuse me, which they were denied twice in separate cases by the Supreme Court. Again, another webinar. But it set the stage for so much more when we talk about land ownership and housing ownership and a lot of the things that came along with it. One of the biggest and I think most impactful policies came with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, and the creation of the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. And this was a creation that underwrote loans for folks. Back in the day, people would just have to put money down, right? You would have to put 5 or 10% down, but with the FHA, they began to underwrite that you could put a certain amount down and they would finance the rest. So while this was happening, Black families were routinely being denied loans and benefits from the FHA, where white people were freely benefit from this. In addition to that, benefits from things like the GI Bill that was created to aid many areas of veterans returning from war, that unspecified, that while not specifically, I should say, denied African-American veterans, the unspecificity added to the inclination of lenders, agents, and developers to not sell to African-Americans, right? So all of this is bounded in race, who was able to purchase. New developments at this time began sprouting up all over the country that explicitly denied Black and brown people from living there. And you can go to the next slide. One of the most famous is Levittown on New York's Long Island, which was one of the first of these quick built developments that explicitly denied people of color. And when I say, I mean, they were building upwards to 16,000 houses, at a time. And so they were getting these folks in there as soldiers were coming back from war, building families and wanting to buy houses. At the same time, there were policies and practices, contracts where it explicitly denied, strongly encouraged developers not to sell to people of color. So these restrictive housing policies would lead to systems of redlining, that's probably a term you've heard, or carving out undesirable neighborhoods of color from desirable neighborhoods that were almost always exclusively white. As time evolved, many of these areas remain largely segregated. And with that came segregation of other institutions like schools, hospitals, banks, etc. In some places like Detroit and in other places, physical barriers were encouraged and built, like physical walls were built to separate these largely white neighborhoods from Black neighborhoods in an effort to keep the housing values up. Now, the trickle-down effect of this is that because of this, we begin to see inequalities in institutions like education and healthcare and finance, which were really closely connected to where you live. So I know that Alan and John are going to talk about what we're seeing in housing inequality and the outcomes based on institutional policies and practices. But I just wanted to highlight kind of in the beginning here before they started speaking, some of the broader implications of the policies on communities most impacted by them. And when we talk about housing, we realize that it's not just a place where you live, but there's so many other areas of life that are tied to your home, your abode, where you live. In areas where property taxes fund schools and home ownership is low, we see less funded schools, right? Education. Access and inaccessibility to hospitals and grocery stores affect health and wellness. The effect goes far beyond whether someone can buy a house. It really is tied to the many inequalities that we see in communities of color all over the country. And as we continue this conversation, I really wanted to give an introduction because I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that some of the trends we see, right, come from a deliberate creation of these policies for a intentional purpose, right? And so as we begin to dismantle racism and institutional racism in these areas of housing and housing inequalities, we hope to see that some of inequalities in other areas, whether it's education, healthcare, finance, opportunities, higher education, we hope to see that they will lessen as well. So I'm going to stop there because I'm so excited to hear what John and Alan have to share with us about the trends that they are seeing and the impact of community colors. But you can go to the next slide. I wanted to leave you a few resources. Like I said, there's so many of them, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to leave you a few resources if you, like me, really get into like this stuff and you wanted to do a deeper dive. The first one is widely known, is probably one of the best books out there on this. And it's The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Another book that we used actually in a course that we did with seniors the past few years called City Stories is How to Kill a City, which is a great book. And the last is a video series actually sponsored by PBS called Race, the Power of Illusion. And it's really a 3-part video series that talks all areas of race, but the last chapter is called The House We Live In. And it really is about the connection to housing, home ownership, and the building of wealth, and the inequities and the discrimination that has come in that. So if you're interested, I absolutely suggest that you take a look at these resources. I think they would be helpful. So that's my introduction.
Thank you, KiKi. Alan, ready for me to go to your slides?
Yes, thank you very much, Meredith. I appreciate that introduction. And I've learned a lot from KiKi just on a couple of phone calls. And then tonight, that's really a tremendous introduction to my part of this discussion. And then I'm looking forward to hearing from John. It's nice to get back together with the St. Stephen's and St. Agnes community. For me, nice to see a couple of class of 1981 folks on the call tonight. So we are excited, and today what I want to speak to are points that KiKi led us to, and that's the disparity in homeownership rates. And I'll speak to the differential between white households and Black households, and I'll break that out using a historical perspective, and then from that historical perspective, look at 4 key variables: income, education, credit history, marital status, all coming from the Urban Institute. And then I'll tie it to a City Global study, and then I hope to breeze through those and then get to what we've seen just in the last couple of weeks that has been very, very impactful. from the transition from President Biden, from his nomination of Marcia Fudge to be HUD Secretary. We are going to see some very, very dramatic steps taken on the housing policy front. So I'm looking forward to that. If you'd advance to the next slide. So what KiKi was teeing up for us was a background for how we got, even pre-60s, how we got to this differential on home ownership rates, where we have a 30-point swing between white household owners, Black household owners. And unfortunately, you see that consistently over this period of time, notwithstanding the 1968 Housing Act that created, for the first time, laws that should have addressed many of the topics that KiKi raised. But as we even get to today, I noticed this morning looking at the trade publications that I read, the Census Bureau put out home ownership rates for the fourth quarter of 2020. So fourth quarter of 2020, you'd think there's not a lot going on. We're in a pandemic, but interest rates very, very low. White home ownership hit a 9-year high in the fourth quarter of 2020. Black home ownership actually edged down. So that begins to tell you that in this time period where you can lock up 2.5% long-term money, white households are better able to leverage that. One other point that I'm going to make, and then we'll go to the next slide, is a study that came out last week that helps really put these numbers into a value. And the study that I saw last week was the tappable home equity for seniors, those age 62 and above. And I pay attention to that as I ascend to their ranks here shortly. But the tappable home equity for those age 62 and above, fourth quarter 2020, was $7.8 trillion. So when you think about, and that's an all-time record, $7.8 trillion, who gets to advantage that tappable home equity? So this is take any encumbrance away. So after your mortgage, there's $7.8 trillion. And what that does is it sets up families to move into their retirement period, an ability to age in place, an ability to have cash to fund healthcare so you can live a longer life. And another point that I'll speak to in a minute, the ability to help out children and others with what we have seen, and you could monetize this over these decade increments, generational wealth. I've had a chance to work with every HUD secretary since 1990, and working for Jack Kemp in the first Bush administration, he used terms like diversity and inclusion before I had ever heard those terms. And when he gathered us together, he talked about the importance of home ownership and the steps that we could take. So there's a lot you can do from a policy perspective. And if you go ahead and advance to the next slide, I mentioned that I'm going to take these home ownership rates and look at 4 key variables: income, education, credit history, and marital status. And you may not be able to read these slides, though they're coming through pretty well, but you can definitely see the trends. So what I'm getting at is, what are the underpinnings of the differential in home ownership rates? And this first one on income, the median household income for Black households is substantially lower. It's $38,000 versus $61,000. This gap is larger for lower income households. And it's interesting to note that young white adults are more likely to have access to financial support from their parents to purchase a home. Reducing the income gap would reduce the Black-white homeownership gap by about 9 points. So you can drive an impact here. If you go to the next slide. Education. For both Black and white households, the homeownership rate increases as you might expect with educational attainment. However, Black households with a bachelor's degree or more were less likely to own their own home than white households without a high school diploma. So when you hear things like that, it really strikes at what's going on here. What are we seeing from the data? If you go to the next slide. This one is one of the more, I think it's one of the more relevant ones to the urban studies, and something that you're going to see action on early in the Biden administration. So credit scores, more than 50% of white households have a FICO credit score above 700, compared to just 20% of Black households. 33% of Black households with credit histories have insufficient credit or lack a credit score, compared to just 17% of white households. So as you're thinking about that, and this lack of credit, or what we in the industry call credit invisibles, you don't have a score. And so to translate that, if I rent my house, I pay my utilities on time, pay my cell phone on time, pay my cable on time, I don't have credit. And how do we know that? How do we, as kids growing up, moving into our first rental, how do we build and establish credit? So there's a big swing here. The share of Black households with a mortgage would increase 10% if their credit score distribution was the same as a white family in this example. And that issue of credit and how credit scores are created, I'm going to speak to, but it's going to be definitely one of the tenets of what the Biden administration will move toward. If you go to the last slide on this part, marital status. Marital status has a strong association with homeownership rates. Compared with white households, Black households are less likely to get married. If Black households were married at the same rate as white households, Black homeownership rate would go up 9 points. So again, Urban's looking for what are the drivers and where could you come across policy. If you go to the next slide. In the event anyone would like to look at the urban study or at this City Global study, I'm sure Meredith could share the deck. I've included hyperlinks to these studies. The city one came out back in the fall, and on the left side, this shows you generally the same point I was making earlier about housing wealth. So we're seeing it from another source. And then on the right-hand side, an interesting component of the city study is that since the housing crisis in 2007, 2008, Black homeowners have had a harder time gaining back the equity that was lost during the crisis, where you see white homeowners have found their way back much more quickly. And I think some of this comes from, and maybe John could speak to this tonight, or as KiKi said, maybe in another webinar, but what do local land policies have, and how do they drive home values? In Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia has a rocket docket, so foreclosures go very quickly. In Maryland, they're much slower. So where are these homes? City also looked at, in the event that Black households had the opportunity to achieve homeownership at the same rate as white households, they would have $5 trillion more in wealth. So there's a lot to look at underneath these data points. If you go to the next slide. I'm going to try to cover a fair amount of ground tonight, but again, housing policy and the mortgage business is what I've done for my career. And I mentioned I have seen different HUD secretaries. So back President Bush, and then 2 terms of Clinton, 2 terms of Bush, 2 terms of Obama, 1 term of Trump. Throughout my time in housing policy, I've never seen an administration so quickly make the point that they're going to make a central goal ending housing discrimination. And President Biden nominated a congresswoman from Ohio, Marcia Fudge, to be HUD secretary. And she had her nomination hearing just last week. If you all want to understand what the Biden administration is looking to accomplish, go back and look at that hearing. It's fascinating. I have not seen a designate HUD secretary come in and talk so forcefully about ending housing discrimination. It's always on the list, but it's number 4 or 5, and does it ever get action? This administration is going to take steps. She also talked about the housing tax credit that we've heard President Biden talk about. She had a little nuance to it that I found interesting as a policy person. She talked about it being a targeted tax credit. So it will be interesting to watch how that plays out. She also is in charge within HUD, KiKi mentioned the FHA. The FHA has they back trillions of dollars of mortgages. They're the largest insurance company, I believe, in the world. Today, they have an actual capital surplus. So by statute, they have to keep a 2% capital ratio. Today, they have a 6% capital ratio. So there are billions of dollars for HUD to look at how they could potentially spend. Secretary-designate Fudge also talked about homelessness. That's an issue very, very important to me. I do work for a company called Skid Row Housing Trust. I've been on Skid Row. I've seen the need, and this isn't spot on to our conversation tonight. But when I think about what we've done over the last year as a country, coming up with a vaccine for COVID, to think that we can't take care of 1 million families, individuals who are homeless, it's challenging for me to know why we can't get that done. So I think you're going to see a much better effort on that. And then the points I made from urban earlier actually come from a good friend of mine, Elena McCargo. She's the point person in the HUD office for taking care of what the secretary wants to do on housing issues. That's a name to follow, someone who will have a very, very loud voice on housing issues. Now, the same day that Marcia Fudge had her hearing, President Biden rolled out a memorandum on ending housing discrimination. We've seen a lot of executive orders, right, over these 2 weeks of President Biden, but I haven't seen one early on in an administration talking about housing discrimination as forcefully as President Biden does. And this memorandum talks about ending housing discrimination, and it's very explicit at taking ownership. We have a problem. We must address this problem. And coming from St. Stephen's, I'm a big student of etymology. It came from the Latin classes I would take at St. Stephen's. But so I look at words, and as I read this memorandum, the term redress really jumped out at me. I underlined it in the text there. So what this administration is going to do, and you see it from several different perspectives, there are going to be funding initiatives to, and we won't see it immediately. You can't close a 30-point gap in a year or 10 years. But I think we'll look back and we'll see that the dollars that have been allocated to housing and to ending housing discrimination will move the needle a little bit. If you go to the next slide. And this is where I will wrap up on this slide and then look forward to John's comments. So last summer, Biden put out a housing plan. I studied that. It's a lengthy document. It helped me understand looking at the candidates running, what each was going to do on housing. And there was a very detailed plan that Biden put out, very, very specific about what he would do, steps he would take. And it is something that President Obama always liked to remind us, that elections have consequences. In this case, you have an election and you have President Biden saying, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And he's actually doing it very, very quickly. So ending housing discrimination, you can't get there overnight. If you put certain policies in place to address some of the issues I mentioned early on, it can really help move the needle. Some of the things that I've been working on with my firm that address these issues, even a year or so back, we started looking at some of the issues KiKi raised. I don't think you use the same terms, but when you think about bias in the process, we did a lot of mortgages last year. We did $4 trillion of new mortgages last year. And part of that process that is woefully inefficient is the appraisal part. So still today, you have an appraiser coming to a house, pulling out a tape measure, doing all the steps that the appraiser needs to do. We have looked for ways to make that process more efficient. And through tools like 3D scanning, where on your cell phone, there's an app where you can actually measure a house's gross living area. And you can do it in a series of thousands of digital images created the same way autonomous driving cars were created. That same technology can smart tag deficiencies in a house. It can recognize appliances, but it can also not recognize certain things. And that's where it fits very well in with President Biden's plans, is when you take the individual out of the appraisal process and it becomes technology, you drive down cost, you make the process more efficient, and you take personality out of a house. You take pictures out of a house. You take things that might unduly influence an appraiser's report. So this is an area that we're working on. We're happy to be working with the administration on this. The next point is credit reform. We're all very familiar. You know, I look at Allison James. I'm sure you know what your FICO score is because you've seen all the commercials. But before the housing crisis, or even when I was in high school, I'd never heard of a credit score. Today, everybody knows what a credit score is. But Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, those providers of credit that roll into a FICO score, they're I think they're going away. I believe what President Biden would like to do is strip all of that out and replace it with a national credit report, something that does include utilities, includes rental, includes cable, so that you can get the opportunity to, I will move it along, Meredith. So I'm going to stop here and let everybody know that if you'd like more information, if any of the folks in the class would like to dig into housing policy, I'd be happy to. John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Alan, for laying the groundwork there to talk about what we've seen in terms of inequality as it relates to housing policy and what we've experienced, frankly, over the last 50 plus years in our country. Laying that foundation and the policies that Alan has talked about have really gotten us to a point now in a number of our cities and areas in our country where the challenges of homeownership and renting in particular urban areas is not just a racial one now, not just an ethnic one, but definitely a socioeconomic one. What we see here in the Northern Virginia, DC metro area has now has a lot more to do with the economics. But for those of us who have studied the history, and as Alan kind of laid out, a number of these policies really set the foundation for the inequality on an economic level. And so now what we look at is the challenges that we have economically, but those are deeply rooted in some of the decades-old policies that were racist, frankly. We know here in the city of Alexandria, we've had some very interesting policies, shall we say. Redlining did happen in our neighborhoods and in our city. We do also know and have current examples of restrictive covenants. For example, there is a member in our community that actually lives in a kind of wealthier part in the city, and he has when he bought his property and was shown his deed and read through his deed, because he's a lawyer and lawyers love to read through deeds and contracts and the like. He actually found in it that his property was not to be sold to any Negroes. And fortunately for him, he is African American. So this came as quite a shock to him. He had already purchased a property, lives there, but it is an example of some of the restrictive covenants that we did have here in the city. Whether or not those are actually legally binding is always actually has been a court case, and of course now they're not legally binding, but you did have a number of those here in the city. And so we have some distinct neighborhoods that you will find even today that do not have or have not had African Americans live there for the duration of those neighborhoods. But we here in the city started in 2013 down a path where we wanted to do what we could to provide equitable opportunities for housing. And so I did want to touch on a couple of things that we know here in the city that have either added to kind of inequality, but I did want to talk about kind of the way forward. I think Alan was continuing to go down that path, and it's in kind of my expertise. That's where I might be able to lend some eyes to. But one of the other things outside of restrictive covenants and redlining was a much actually softer inequality issue. Alexandria, for those who know about our city, we have some historic districts. We have the Old and Historic District, which is in Old Town proper, and we also have the Parker Gray Historic District. The creation of those historic districts are not about inequality in and of itself. It's really about preserving the feel of a certain time point in history for the Old Historic District. That time point is going to be closer to the colonial age into the 19th century. And the Parker Gray Historic District really focuses on preserving the architectural quality of the mid 40s to 50s into the early 60s. But I came across a number of articles that talked about the community discussion and conversation that popped up as Alexandria was looking to formalize the Parker Gray District as a historic district. Historically, this area of the city, which is close to the northeastern part of the city, had been since the 1930s historically African American. The housing at that time was still affordable in the 70s, but there was a push to add another historic district to the city of Alexandria. And for a number of historians, this part of the city caught its eye. And so there was, I think, a years-long debate publicly about the creation of this historic district. And for a number of the African-American members and community leaders living in that section of the city, their fear was the creation of this historic district would drive up costs and make these homes tougher for the African American community members that were owning them, tougher for them to hold on to. But for those who are not familiar with the historic district, some of the downside to owning a home in a historic district is going to be the upkeep. You have to use certain paint, certain materials, or be fined, frankly. And so you have to keep your, especially the exterior of your home, to a certain type. And so that became a challenge for a number of community members, and frankly, sometimes to this day, it is for those who may live in the historic district. But what we would see in Alexandria in the 20+ years after the creation of that Parker Gray district is that many of those African American owners that actually pushed back against the creation of the historic district were correct. Little by little, many of those homeowners ended up being kind of pushed out of their homes due to the upkeep. You had a number who tried to sell to other members of their family, but those members as well would kind of end up losing those homes. And you have very few members of the original Parker Gray families that live in that district. And so many of those folks have been priced out along with, frankly, other market forces that have contributed to gentrification within the city. And so those three, and I actually, as the third, I mentioned gentrification. That has been something that we have seen not only in the city, but also in this region. But Alexandria itself definitely has suffered through that change. Many areas of the city that had either a strong African American presence and home ownership presence, or mixed communities that had a mixture of different backgrounds have kind of fallen due to many of the market pressures that have pushed people out, whether it's upkeep of homes, higher taxes, or the value of land. And so a number of those things have contributed to changes that we've seen in the city over the last 20 years. But what I wanted to do in looking at this and taking what Alan has kind of left us as a foundation is kind of look at the next steps. What are cities, particularly cities like Alexandria, trying to do to deal with that inequity and try to challenge it or fight back against it in a planning process? So Meredith, if you could bring up the presentation that we had. Right, you can go to the next slide. So again, in 2013, the city developed a housing master plan. Again, this housing master plan was based on the fact that we knew that we had housing inequity within our city. And so the focus is trying to make sure people of all socioeconomic backgrounds have at least a fighting chance to find opportunity here, whether it's rental or ownership for housing in the city. And also, while doing that, making sure that we distribute that housing across the city. As you'll see in a map later, we're still being challenged by that piece, but the goal of housing affordability is not to only allow it in one certain place in the city, but to allow it across the city. Next page. And as part of our housing master plan, we did have a goal of 2,500 units by, actually it's now bumped up to 2,500 units by 2030. We have been making pretty significant progress, but as you can see, there is a lot of progress to show, or it's left, excuse me. And this progress does not really account for some of the losses that we are taking. On another presentation that we routinely show in the city, over the course of the last 15 years, the city has lost up to, I think it's about 80% of its affordable market rate housing, meaning that, the affordable housing due to the market. That means housing that is not subsidized by the government. This is just regular affordable housing that exists within communities. You might think of some of the older garden style apartments, maybe smaller homes. If you're familiar with the city, parts of the West End that have housing, kind of original housing dating back to the 50s and 60s. That's what's known as kind of market rate affordable or market affordable, housing, because it is built and it's a little bit older, and so it has come down in price for the generally speaking. Same with the apartments as well. And about 80% of those have gone away. That's due to the market, due to the kind of the rise and need of housing in this area. That has pushed the price of all the housing, frankly, in the city up. And so you have a greater need for affordable housing and challenges to keep it. So the city has been focused on kind of setting aside housing and working to buy down property that individuals may be able to afford, and working with developers to also have them set aside housing as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we are very keenly aware of is this question of who can afford in the city. You look at some of the hourly wages of individuals that are living in our city. And as you go through that list, you'll find that, not to mess it up for you, but you'll find that all but four at the bottom are even close to the $76,000 a year needed to own a one bedroom or rent a one bedroom here in the city. And so that is a strong challenge, because as we know, not everybody is going to be able to afford to live here. And so how do we best set the table for opportunities for home ownership or rental as well? So if we go to the next slide. Housing burden. Housing burden is also something that we have started to look at as well. It's not only the cost of housing, but a cost of the percentage of that cost as it relates to your whole income. Because as many of us know, we don't want to spend all of our money on housing and not be able to afford the rest of the things that we need to be able to afford to live life, especially if we have a family that has additional expenses, such as education or childcare. And so we have started to look at and focus on this idea that 30% of income should be, roughly 30% of income should be spent on housing. And so how can we, as we look to create housing policy, align with that thought in terms of housing burden? One of the things that we also know as a interior city is that we end up having more people commute into the city than already live in the city and own homes here. And what does that mean as it relates to housing? It means that our standard of living is challenged, because if we're going to have increased transportation and congestion on our roads, that is, one, going to mean something for the individuals that live here, and two, that is also going to mean something for people that don't live here. Because as you move out, even though, let's say you have a choice between a house here in Alexandria and a house in Fredericksburg, but you work in Alexandria or DC. If you live in Alexandria, there are probably a number of options for you to have a lower cost in your transportation costs and your housing costs combined versus your housing costs and transportation costs if you live further out and have to travel in to the city. And so that is, in terms of trends, that is a trend that we are seeing here in our city. We know as we look at our own workforce in the city, roughly about 10% of Alexandria's employees live in the city. 90% of our employees live outside the city and have to drive or take transit to get here. And so there's an additional burden that comes with having to rely on regular transportation and fund that as well as part of somebody's overall cost burden. Next slide. So one of the things that we have very kind of bluntly done in the city over the past 10 years is really look at opportunities to develop or redevelop. If you're familiar with Alexandria, in the 80s and early 90s, we had significant parts of Alexandria that were railroad tracks. For those of us who have been in Alexandria for even longer than that, you might remember when Potomac Yards was a big big rail yard. And parts of Duke Street, particularly as you moved into the city, were also rail yard as well. A lot of that area has been now redeveloped. Potomac Yard is a pretty massive new neighborhood that has started to pop up, and a number of the buildings here, particularly the ones near the top, are buildings that are in that particular neighborhood. If you're looking at all these buildings, the third one down on the left side, looks like, yes, right there, is actually one of the neater affordable housing projects that the city has done. As we've started to redevelop, we've looked at opportunities to locate or co-locate, what we call co-locate municipal services and affordable housing. And so as part of the redevelopment for Potomac Yards, we knew there was a need for fire service in that general area. And so we had a fire station building. You can kind of make it out by the big green doors, a fire station built, and then over top of the fire station, about 64 units of affordable housing. And so leveraging the city's assets and space to create actual units is something that we work to do. One of the other things that we have done in terms of working to create new opportunities is started to work with our public housing authority. It's actually called the Alexandria Redevelopment and Housing Authority, or AHA, that owns about 9 different properties. When I say properties, I mean, frankly, neighborhoods within the city, and work with them into retaining the affordable units that they have, while being able to not only subsidize those units, but also make sure that those units are able to have an affordability stability. When I say that, if you're familiar with federal housing policy, Section 8 and public housing policy has changed very much over the last 8 years. And so being able to make sure that we are able to stabilize some of the public housing communities that we have into the future, we have begun to work to transform some of those to mixed use development, thereby being able to save the affordability within those sites. Also, a big piece of this is, and for any city, it's really about local investment. The city has really stepped up its game in recent decades to provide either direct funding in direct cash, or opportunities for loans with nonprofit developers and others who are seeking to ensure that affordable housing remains here in the city. With what we've done, and the best way we've done that is to ensure that we have affordable housing in each of the small area plans or neighborhood plans that we have in the city. And so that has become a key instrument that we look forward to making sure remains in each of our cities. And so as we do some of our planning, we make sure that's a key metric that we watch for and take note of. We'll go to the next slide. And so as we talk about some of those neighborhoods and I talk about some of those area plans, here is a more recent detailing of each of those plans. One of the things you will see as you do see different plans that have popped up throughout the city, you will see areas also where we don't have plans in the kind of central core of the city. There is no small area plan in those parts of the city. And those are some of the areas that we have the most challenge in trying to have affordable housing remain. And so this is part of the ongoing policy struggle that we do have here in the city. We do have what we call the development crescent that, as you can see, starts in the northeast side of the city, kind of swings down to the south and then across to the west and back up. And so as you look at that development crescent, there are opportunities there to increase, not only preserve, but increase affordable housing. But we are leaving out a significant portion of that. And if we say as a city that we are looking to create affordable housing in every neighborhood or everywhere in our city, we are leaving out a significant portion of the city as we try to do so. And so that is the current challenge for elected leadership here, is how to look at all areas, not just most areas, but all areas of the city and see how we create and preserve affordability within the city. And so going to the next slide is going to talk about some of the tools that we will use or we have been using as we try to maintain affordability. If you're an Alexandria resident, you may have read in the newspaper some of the controversy about ADUs or accessory dwelling units here in the city. For those who may not know what an ADU is, so I'll explain that on a future slide, but it is a way we believe that we can have additional housing stock. This stock is going to be very limited to a certain number and certain type of people in terms of space needs, as we'll see when we get to that slide. But it is a tool that we do have here in trying to create equity in housing in the city. Number two, as was said earlier, direct funding from the city is going to be needed. So housing contributions and those contributions sometimes offset with the contributions of the development community can improve the number of units that we do have in the city. As we look forward into the future, we want to not only just use money, but we do want to use policy a little bit more as well. And so inclusionary zoning and zoning for housing are two of the ways that we believe in the future we can rely less on taxpayer dollars, but really rely on the policy, quality housing policy to inject actual units into the marketplace. As we use different tools, we do have to keep our progress and watch that progress and make sure we're meeting our targets. And so we have had a regular housing summit, as well as a report card from city staff to talk to our Affordable Housing Advisory Committee about where we stand as it relates to our goals. And are we meeting our goals? And what do we need to do to continue to meet our goals into the future? One of the things that we want to use a little bit more as we try to meet some of those future goals is our pilot rental subsidy. We know that not everyone can own a home, and being able to rent here in the city is starting to be much more of a challenge. And so looking at a rental subsidy program to create more affordable units here in the city is something that we are going to tease out further as we get into the future. One of the more beneficial things of recent has been some of the partnerships we've had with nonprofit developers as well as our church communities. Some of the churches that we have in the city don't have, unfortunately, don't have the congregation size that they used to. And so some of them have looked at what their future is and looked at an opportunity to leverage the land that they have for public benefit. And so we have a number of examples here, the Spire and the Waypoint, which are two projects that will be, one just broke ground maybe about a month ago, and the Waypoint broke ground about a year ago. And so they are working in, towards construction and finishing up. And so we hopefully will have them on the market in the next 2 years. One of the, I think, more impressive projects that have come along is the Bloom/Carpenter Shelter. The Carpenter Shelter has been a nonprofit for decades here in the city, running one of the private shelters that we have here. And some years ago, they started a process where they wanted to well, they frankly saw the height around them and a number of buildings growing, and they wanted to use leverage their ability to provide housing by redeveloping their shelter. They just opened their doors with an expanded shelter, but also on top of their shelter, which holds 60 people, 95 units of housing that are going to help those in a kind of lower income strata. Again, with number 6, it's again the policy that we are working on here in the city. Our RMF zone is going to allow for a more affordable housing as redevelopment comes into the city. And again, number 7 is money. Financial support is really what is going to help a number of these projects move forward. My last couple slides, I'll go over very quickly. Accessory dwelling units, secondary unit. Some of you may, this may look like a garage. And so folks are now looking at turning garage spaces and other spaces similar to this into housing. Also, we have a new policy here in the city where you might be able to take advantage of your basement. If you have a certain size basement, you may be able to take advantage of that into turning it into an accessory dwelling unit as well, thereby giving, frankly, many families an opportunity to create housing that they're, whether they're older members of the family or some of those members fresh out of college may be able to take advantage of. Next slide. Another project that's coming down the pike for the city is probably one of the larger nonprofit buildings that we, partnerships that we might be undertaking. If folks are familiar with this from a bird's eye view, you might not be, but this is right at the corner of Glebe and Mount Vernon. There's a big parking lot there with a former grocery store. That is going to be looked at as an opportunity for development of housing to create additional supply of affordable housing here in the city. And so those conversations are just starting. And if you are a local resident, feel free to, of course, weigh in on those projects. But again, and we can flip to the end. Again, here in the city, we are kind of looking at the best way to increase supply so that folks do have the opportunity, because we believe it's that opportunity that people have before even we look at their credit, we look at the amount of money they've saved up before they can even kind of launch into that process. If they don't have anywhere to buy or rent, that's going to be a big part of lack of opportunity for them to remain in the city. And so one of the things that our council has really looked at is how we can, as respectfully and appropriately as possible, increase housing supply so that we can actually have that conversation about inequality and trying to reverse it. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Meredith, so we can take questions.
Thank you, everyone. I need to go back through John's slides now and go in on kind of some of those neighborhoods as an Alexandria resident myself. This was really interesting. Thank you all. Feel free to start putting any chats or sorry, questions in the chat. KiKi, I might put you on the spot. Is there anything after hearing Alan and John speak that you might want to reflect on or pose a question yourself?
I was talking with Meredith about this when we had decided, when she was thinking of doing this, and I was like, I'm gonna get all like nerdy, right? Because I love this kind of stuff. I love this kind of stuff, and just really the connection, right? And I guess, looking at Alan's presentation and some of the I guess intentional policies that are happening now. You had mentioned that you thought in your many years of working with HUD and with the directors in different administrations that this was going to be the most impactful. Can you just maybe tell us one specific area that you think is going to make the most immediate impact in this new housing policy as it relates to kind of addressing kind of some of the institutionalized racism and discrimination that we had talked about earlier in this conversation?
Sure, KiKi, thanks for the question. And I think there are a lot of examples, but the most important is when you put it all out there and you're very frank and candid with the industry that we have a persistent issue and it has had this pernicious effect over decades. And now we're going to take steps to address it. I think that opens the door. And secondly, putting leaders in who are sensitive to creating policy that begins to reverse the bias that has been in the system will go a long way. I didn't really get a chance to talk about appraisal bias. That will definitely be addressed, and credit. So there's a quick 4 for you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I do have a question in the chat. John, this might be directed for you. What is Oakville Triangle? Our guest had never heard of this before.
So Oakville Triangle is a small triangular neighborhood right off of Route 1. If you're familiar with that area, the best landmark I can give you is, I think there's only about one, there's only one gas station on that corridor on Route 1. It's going to be in that section. It's actually a warehouse, kind of warehouse district right now. You've got a warehouse district, a number of warehouses, and a number of kind of parking lots for van parking and bus parking. And so it's very industrial. And that is going to be redeveloped. And actually we approved in that area a small healthplex. It's actually not that small, but Inova is building a healthplex. And so there's going to be a medical facility there as well as housing as well.
Thanks. Erin, did you have a question?
I did. Thank you all very much for this conversation. It's been great. So John, everything you were talking about, affordable housing specifically in the city here, when Avi and I lived in Philadelphia, we lived in an area that was at the beginning of gentrification, and it was a historically Black neighborhood. And Philadelphia has lots of historically Black neighborhoods that have undergone various forms of gentrification to varying degrees of success. And we learned when we lived there that after a failure of epic proportions in another neighborhood with property taxes, when they started changing things over in our particular neighborhood, allowances were made for residents who had been in their homes for a certain amount of time to keep their property tax levels at, artificially low compared to the market, because, our neighbors across the street had been in their house for 80 years and had gone through multiple generations. And there were a lot of people in the neighborhood like that. So while we could afford to pay whatever the market taxes were, somebody who's living on Social Security cannot.
Right.
And I was curious if the city had explored similar things. I mean, on my mother's block alone, she has lived there for 20 years, but her next door neighbor is 95 and lives alone and moved in there as a young father in his 20s. Are we exploring similar kinds of things with taxes?
Yes, we actually are. We do have a program for older Alexandrians who do own homes to try to keep that, just like you talked about, to try to keep their property taxes artificially low. We probably have not adjusted that program in at least probably 6 or 7 years, but it still does exist. We do have a number of members that take advantage of it. And I know one of the things that we did at least 2 years ago is really invested, or I wouldn't say invested, but we kind of changed how staff communicated it out because prior to that, we really wasn't seeing it enough, what we believed was enough participants. We have an older population here in Alexandria, especially an older population that owns property. And so we've been trying to make sure folks know about the program so they can take advantage of it. Because it is out there, and we do understand the plight of older Alexandrians trying to stay here in the city and age in place. That has been actually a focus of definitely a part of the government, at least for the last 5 years, trying to get older Alexandrians the ability to age in place, not only with housing and property, but also some of the services as well.
Cool, thank you.
That's
it. We have one last question here. It says, as more and more companies are remoting their businesses, it seems that there is an opportunity to convert disused commercial properties into affordable housing. Is anyone working on that?
Can I go ahead and answer that? Sure. So that is something we are looking at in the market. We are expecting that as we kind of see the end-ish of the pandemic. That is something we think that we're going to see. We've had at least one property in the probably last 3 months change over from a commercial to a residential property. Because of what we believe is going to be a trend after the pandemic. We know that we're going to see a lot smaller, we're going to see businesses take up a lot smaller commercial space. We already have a couple of projects here in the city where there is a process of, I would say, kind of work-life balance within the project, where individuals are able to have a unit and use that unit for both business and kind of residential use. It's actually a quite interesting concept, but we believe that we're going to see more intentional uses be kind of duplicated in the same space. And so you're going to have a lot more mixed use property coming out of this that's going to intentionally have business or office in the same space as living in residential, due in part to feelings that people have coming out of this pandemic.
Thank you, John. And I think possibly one more here.
Yeah.
Oops, hang on a second. I recently learned that one of the many reasons why many Black families lose their homes is because of a lack of clean titles on their homes. This allows investors and developers to force the sale of a home. Lots of Black folks don't have access to legal services that will make it clear who owns the home they live in and that the occupants think they own. Are the Biden administration and the city of Alexandria addressing this issue?
I can speak for the city. I think one of the things that we did recently, because we did have, I know about a couple of incidents where we've had this. We partner with, now I'm going to get the organization's name wrong. It's a Northern Virginia nonprofit that has basically pro bono lawyers that are willing to work on a number of cases. the city partners with them on a number of immigration cases, but we also partner with them on a number of other legal matters. And so we have, frankly, sent folks to them to get some of this stuff actually worked out, so that we can hopefully ensure that some of these folks are able to kind of keep their house and clean that title.
Alan, any thoughts on the Biden side, or the administrative side on that?
Sure. So on the macro level, HUD housing counselors are available and will be funded at a much higher level so that they'll be able to address issues like that. There's a great organization that was stood up during the crisis that still exists, Hope Now. So 1-800-HOPE NOW, anyone can dial in and get that type of assistance.
That's great. Any other questions before we wrap up and thank all of our guests?
I have one. It seems to me that there's going to be a big tug of war between the credit companies and the investors who need to protect their values. I know Mr. Jones told us that the Biden administration is going to try and improve that or change it. Could you address any of that info, Alan?
So are you saying the secondary market investors? As I understood the question, it relates to the protections that the secondary market has when they're buying loans. So as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac collect and securitize mortgage-backed securities, they have reps and warrants around the existing collateral. And if the credit standards change, are those reps and warrants still enforceable? And what the Biden administration will look to do, they can do immediately through Ginnie Mae, that's part of HUD. So for all FHA, VA, USDA mortgages, they can make those changes unilaterally. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac come under the purview of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, FHFA, and that's a non-political appointee sitting in that role. So there will be much more of the tug of war that you mentioned for the Fannie and Freddie securities. To go back again to KiKi's point, we could have a whole webinar on the legal reps and warrants around how loans are packaged into securities and the rights of the investors. But it's a good point you're raising. They will take steps to, as quickly as possible, change the credit standards.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, John, Alan, KiKi. And we will make sure to send out these slides as well, John and Alan, if that's okay. I know that there were both links and a lot of really interesting information folks may want to review. So we will send those out to all of our registrants tonight as well.
Great.
Thank you, Meredith.
Thank you.
Thanks, Meredith.
And please make sure to keep checking your email and checking our events page. We will continue this series as long as we can. And any other suggestions come our way. Just for everyone's reference, Alan is the one who reached out to me and we had a phone call and I was like, yes, I'm totally on board. And I told KiKi and she said, yes, let's bring John on board. And it was great. This is one really big benefit for our virtual community is that we're able to gather both our speakers and our guests much quicker than if we were trying to do this in person. So I thank all of you and I hope you all continue to join us.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.